Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Borshika Rabin. I am an implementation scientist at the University of California, San Diego, and a member of the National REAM PRISM Work Group and Consortium. I am very excited to welcome you to the first 2026 REAM PRISM webinar. And this is a webinar that will be presented by Dr. Emily Dunstan, and I will introduce Dr. Dunstan in a moment. I am also serving as a co-presenter, but mainly today I'm going to serve in the role of a facilitator to help us get through the content and then also to answer questions. A few logistical issues. We are recording this session and it is going to be made available. We recommend that during the presentation you use the chat function to send us questions, observations, resources that you think everyone would be interested in, and we will be triaging those questions. I am going to also read those questions as Emily is presenting and bring them in as needed, but most likely we will wait to the end. The way the presentation is structured, there is plenty of time for discussion, so please stay around and bring your ideas forward. And I believe Alejandra will be able to make people panelists so they can also speak. So just raise your hand and then she will be able to make you into a panelist when it's appropriate. Thank you for being here. And then let me immediately move into the introduction of Emily. Dr. Emily Dunstan is a second-year T32 primary care research fellow at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. She holds a PhD in health and kinesiology from the University of Utah, and she's also the inaugural National REAM and PRISM Consortium Fellow. We were very excited to welcome our first fellow, her, in 2025, late January, early February. And she has been working with us on a project that we think is very important for the field, for us, as we advance the use of REAM and PRISM specifically in the qualitative research realm. And I will tell you a little bit more about that. Dr. Dunstan's research spans primary care, oncology, and geriatrics, with a focus on leveraging dissemination and implementation science methods to deliver exercise programs for people living with cancer in oncology and primary care settings. She aims to develop pathways to support referrals to cancer rehabilitation and exercise services, particularly for older adults with cancer. And some of you who joined earlier, you heard us discussing these wonderful opportunities in the field of kinesiology and how you can shape your career. So Emily, we are so excited to have you present about your project that you completed as part of your fellowship. And I will provide a few introductory remarks as we discussed and then hand it over to you for the main presentation. So we decided on this project as the first main project for a fellow for REAM and PRISM because we realized that the use of PRISM in the qualitative realm is increasing. We have seen more and more papers emerging where people use the practical, robust implementation and sustainability model as the main model guiding qualitative research. But we have never provided guidance as the consortium on how to think about the use of PRISM. We also knew from our own work that it's not always straightforward how to operationalize different components, and we wanted to learn from each other. So often there are informal sharings of these instruments that exist for qualitative research around PRISM, but we didn't have a place where we could share those publicly. And so the idea of bringing these together, making them available and creating guidance around it was very appealing to us. And Emily also got excited about it. So she did an incredible job and she will share all of the findings and all of the things that are coming after her work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to her with the repeat encouragement of use of chat moving forward. And then hopefully we can have a very good discussion after the presentation. Emily, thank you so much. And let me hand this over to you and we can see your slides well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Porshika. I'm so thrilled to be here with you all. And it's great to see so many familiar names in the chat as well as you guys are introducing yourselves. So if you have met me before, it's great to see you again. If not, I'm happy to be here and introduce you to a little bit of the work I have been doing with the PRISM group as well. Just to start, I want to recognize that I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose, but I did receive funding from HRSA for my time that was spent on this project. So using a theory and model or framework can help guide qualitative data collection in dissemination and implementation science. And there have been many theories, models, and frameworks that have been applied to qualitative data collection. There's published guidance on many of these theories, models, and frameworks in qualitative research, including the RE-AIM framework, the normalization process theory, CIFAR, and IPARIS. And I imagine some of you on the call today are familiar with some of these. PRISM is particularly well suited for qualitative data collection because it is dynamic, multi-level, and connects context to outcomes. So if you envision the qualitative research that you are interested in conducting as a flashlight, if you are to shine that light through PRISM, you can organize your contextual assessment into four main buckets, which are first, multi-level perspectives on the intervention by management, staff, and patients. Second, multi-level partner characteristics, which include demographic characteristics and organizational characteristics. Third, the external environment, which includes policies, guidelines, and incentives that may impact the implementation and sustainment of an evidence-based intervention. And fourth, implementation and sustainability infrastructure, which includes the resources and capacity of an organization, such as having a dedicated staff member to support an intervention or priorities of an organization, for example. And then these four PRISM domains can then be directly linked to the RE-AIM outcomes. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with RE-AIM as you are on this call and interested in this webinar, but I just wanted to briefly touch on the big picture of how for each of these domains, just to make sure everyone is on the same page as we move forward in this presentation. So reach is the first of the RE-AIM dimensions, and that's the number or characteristics of patients and community members that participate in an intervention. Then there is effectiveness, which really focuses on the impact of an intervention on health outcomes or other important outcomes. Adoption, which is the number of settings or people who deliver the intervention and are willing to initiate the intervention. Implementation, which is delivering the intervention as intended, which includes things like fidelity or cost considerations. And then maintenance, the extent to which an intervention is delivered over the long term or becomes part of a routine practice within an organization. And so as Borshka mentioned earlier, there was a scoping review that found that over 2/3 of studies that apply PRISM in their research have some form of qualitative data collection. So the majority of studies that are using PRISM have some form of qualitative data collection in them. And there are a lot of good examples of how PRISM has been used in qualitative research. There was a recent paper from Linda Saugen and colleagues that applied PRISM and is an excellent example of how PRISM could be used. And then there's an paper that's a bit older from McCrate and colleagues, some of you may be familiar with it, that really demonstrated how PRISM could be applied to qualitative projects across multiple phases of implementation, but all of the projects within this paper were in a single setting, which was the VA. And so really missing from the literature was an understanding of how to apply PRISM in qualitative research, not only across multiple phases of implementation, but also multiple research settings from clinics to community settings, as well as interviewee roles. So engaging with people not only who are implementing the intervention, but also the recipients of the intervention who are experiencing that from that lens. And so the purpose of this project was really twofold. First, we aimed to evaluate how PRISM has been applied in qualitative data collection within dissemination and implementation science, through which we developed a database of exemplar qualitative guides, and we'll get to a tour of that a little bit later in the presentation. And then second, we also developed some practical guidance on how to rigorously apply PRISM in qualitative research. So first, I'm going to describe the process of creating the qualitative database to give you some context on how that was developed. So we collected exemplar interview and focus group guides from members of the National PRISM and RE-AIM Consortium and ended up with 31 guides across 13 distinct research studies. We then operationalized the PRISM domains so that they could be applied uniformly across all guides and labeled each question from each guide with the appropriate PRISM domains and ream dimensions that that question addressed. We then iteratively developed a database that was developed with input from the PRISM and REAM consortium and input all of those questions that we had labeled into the database before we ultimately tested the functionality of the database to make sure that it would be usable. And so this is a screenshot of what the home page of the database looks like. Might be a bit small on your screen, but we'll show it full scale later. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what it looks like. So you can see that this first page is similar kind of to like a table of contents where each row is an individual interview or focus group guide. And it shows you on a guide level kind of what is included in the database overall. And there was a lot of different information here, including where the guides came from, if there's a citation available for that study, as well as the data collection type, the topic that the study addressed, and the population that the guides were used with, as well as what phase of implementation. You can see on the far right-hand corner, there's some check boxes to show you when the guide was used in terms of implementation phases. And then in addition to this home page or this initial tab in the database, we then have an individual tab for each of the PRISM domains and the REAIM dimensions. And you can see that each row is an individual question with information about how that question was used, where that question came from, again, implementation phase, the topic, the role of the person it was used with are all outlined, as well as whether or not that question was addressed by multiple PRISM domains and REAIM dimensions, or just a single domain is also noted as well. And so to just provide you with a high-level overview of what is included in this database, of the 31 guides, the vast majority of the guides were used in individual interviews. And while most of the guides were used in settings that focused on healthcare, there were 4 different types of settings represented across all the guides, with the VA being the most common. In terms of interviewee role, 20 of the guides were used to interview implementers, and 11 of the guides were used to interview recipients. The guides were used across all phases of implementation, but the most common phase was the post-implementation phase. So what did we find in terms of how PRISM was being applied across all the guides in the database? The most common PRISM domains across all the guides were perspectives of the implementers and recipients and the implementation and sustainability infrastructure domain. However, the questions that addressed the perspectives of the implementers domain were most common during the implementation phase, while the perspectives of the recipients and implementation and sustainability infrastructure were more commonly used in the post-implementation phase. The characteristics domains, including those of implementers and recipients, as well as the external environment domain, were much less commonly used, with only 72 questions addressing external environment compared to 201 questions addressing the perspectives of the implementers, just to give you an idea of the differences in how prevalent these different domains were. Overall, the REAIM dimensions were much less commonly addressed than PRISM domains. Implementation was the most commonly addressed REAIM dimension, with 113 questions that addressed implementation. And the least common domains were reach, maintenance, and adoption. And interestingly, only about a quarter of the maintenance questions were in the post-implementation phase, with the majority being asked in the implementation phase, suggesting that they might have been planning for implementation in the use of those questions. There were also only 23 questions that addressed adoption. So again, you can see the differences with 113 for implementation and 23 questions addressing adoption. It's quite a bit of variability there. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and focus on recommendations when using PRISM in qualitative research. And these guidelines were generated with input from the members of the National PRISM and REAIM Consortium. So PRISM can help advance your qualitative research in several ways. First, PRISM helps to zero in on a modest number of contextual factors to focus on. Often there's a lot to focus on when we're trying to evaluate context, so it helps to narrow it down a bit. Second, PRISM facilitates the comparison of perspectives on the intervention across roles, including recipients and implementers. Third, PRISM guides an examination of how context changes over time. And PRISM provides linkage between contextual factors and implementation outcomes. There's also numerous existing resources available to support your research using PRISM. You can find these resources on the REAIM website, which is listed there. First, of course, the qualitative database I flashed a couple slides earlier is available, and I'll show you how to access that and how to use it on the REAIM website in a bit. There's also frequently asked questions about how to use PRISM and apply it to your own work, as well as some example qualitative guides so that you can see a complete guide written up using the PRISM to inform the development of that guide. So when using PRISM in qualitative data collection, it's important to not only consider the PRISM domains, but also the REAIM dimensions as you develop your guide. As Russ Glasgow always likes to say, PRISM includes REAIM, and so considering REAIM when developing a qualitative data collection guide can help you think about things like planning for maintenance or sustainability earlier on in your research project. It's also really important to tailor questions within a qualitative data collection guide to the different perspectives of participants. So the way you address a PRISM domain may vary based on the participant's perspective. So for example, the questions that I'm going to show you here were part of a single study where both implementers, who are community healthcare workers in this case, and recipients, who are people who were receiving an intervention, were asked a similar question that addressed implementation and sustainability infrastructure. But you can see how there's differences in how the question is phrased, and even the amount of background information that's included for participants in different roles. Where the implementer question is really focused on resources, and the recipient question kind of gives a bit more background information to make sure that they understand the context that they might not be privy to that the implementer probably already has since they're delivering the intervention on a regular basis. Along those same lines, questions should also be tailored to the phase of implementation when you are collecting the qualitative data. So on this slide is an example of a different study that collected qualitative data in the pre-implementation, implementation, and post-implementation phases. And so each of these three questions addresses again the implementation and sustainability infrastructure domain in guides for only implementers. But with the pre-implementation question, it really is asking people to think ahead. The implementation question is asking about resources for ongoing implementation, and the post-implementation is asking people to reflect back on their experience with the intervention overall. So practically, when creating a qualitative data collection guide using PRISM, it's helpful to label each guide, or each question in the guide, excuse me, with PRISM domains and REAIM dimensions it addresses. So you can see here on the screen is a snippet of an existing qualitative guide, and the first few questions are more introductory and don't have PRISM labels, but then questions 3 through 5 have the PRISM and REAIM dimensions tagged there in blue so that it can help keep track of what you were thinking when you developed the guide and what you're trying to get out of each of those questions. So it can help be a reminder to your future self, because sometimes with research, we forget what our past self was thinking. It can also be really helpful to communicate with other members of your research team if you have different people doing the interviews and the people who develop the guides so that they know what the intent behind a question was, and can also be helpful to help organize and guide your data analysis. As I mentioned, those first two questions on the screen don't have PRISM domain or REAIM dimension tags, and that is okay. It's okay to include questions in your guide that don't map onto specific domains if needed to achieve the goal of your study. And that was the case for many of the guides in the database, particularly at the beginning of guides when you're trying to get people just oriented to a study and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So the last recommendation focuses on the data analysis phase of qualitative research. And PRISM can be used to guide analysis, whether it be using the PRISM domains for deductive coding or using the PRISM domains in a rapid qualitative analysis matrix. And that's not to say that you can't use inductive coding or a hybrid of inductive and deductive coding when using PRISM, but depending on the objective of the study, deductive coding alone may be appropriate, or you may need a different approach. Last, PRISM can help organize findings during your analysis, but also the reporting of your findings as well, just to help your reader kind of make sense of complex multi-level data. When you have implementers and recipients and different phases of implementation, it can be a lot to track. So using PRISM as a guiding framework can help keep it clear and concise when reporting your findings as well as doing your analysis. So, as promised, we will talk about how to access the database and use it in your own research. So you can scan this QR code, or you can go to reaim.org, and I will share my screen in a minute and show you exactly how to get there. But I just want to offer a few conclusions before I do so. So first, PRISM is well suited to guide qualitative research. Not only does it focus on multi-level contextual assessment, it also links contextual factors to outcomes. And when using PRISM, you can and should apply PRISM to every stage of your qualitative research, from identifying a research question all the way through data analysis. And tailoring the guides to implementation stage and interviewee role will help support rigorous and in-depth qualitative data collection in your research. So I'd want to take a moment just to acknowledge the phenomenal team that was behind the work. I had the honor of leading this project, but there were so many great people who were contributors, including Borshka, as well as many other members of the National PRISM and REAIM Consortium. So I just want to highlight their contributions as well. And then Borshka, should we put our questions up now for people, or should we do the tour first? What are your thoughts?
Excellent question. Why don't we show the questions briefly, Emily, and then after do the tour so people can start to think about this. I am also going to reiterate my invitation for chat use for more questions. Please use it. We are very close to opening it up for discussion. As I mentioned, we will have plenty of time for discussion.
Great. So these are the questions we have for you all, and we would love to get your thoughts. You can either put them in the chat or maybe raise your hand in a bit, either way. But things to think about as I show the database are just how you might see yourself using the PRISM qualitative database. And then based on the recommendations that I shared, what additional guidance or questions maybe do you have about the recommendations that were presented? And then how would you like to see the qualitative database and information and resources about how to use PRISM for qualitative research disseminated? Where would you like to go to find this information? What would be helpful for you? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a brief moment here, just to organize my screens. And then I will reshare.
Emily, do you have time for a quick question?
Sure.
Okay, sorry. So Julianne Myers put it in the chat and also in the Q&A. But she's saying that her team is looking to have some additional guidance on how to use PRISM appropriately. So do you have any recommendations for how to consider PRISM and REAIM within a logic model for intervention implementation?
Yeah, I think PRISM fits really well into a logic model, and REAIM can do that nicely. Borshika, are there examples of logic models on the website?
That is a great question. So we have one paper that I would like to recommend, which I will put in the chat. It was led by Russ, and it used PRISM in the logic model context for 3 different studies within a query program. I think that that's a great example. I do know that we have a number of other studies where PRISM was incorporated into the implementation research logic model. I don't know how many of those are in the process of being published or available as protocols. But at a minimum, this one that I am going to share is in publication. I will also say that I love the idea of using PRISM in the context of this logic model in the early phase. Julianne mentioned that they are in the early phase. And then thinking about revisiting it over time. So, developing the logic model, how you envision this happening, the ideal state, and then over time changing that as you are learning what is feasible or what is happening on the ground. So I will put in an example here and then hand it back to Emily for her demo. And yes, please continue adding your questions here and we will capture those.
Great, thank you. So I have just gone ahead, you should be seeing my Google search bar here, and I have just searched ReAIM in Google, and it pulls reaim.org up as the first option for me. Hopefully it also does for you. So if you click on that, and then it takes you to the ReAIM website, you can then go over to resources and tools, and then a few options down is the PRISM qualitative database. And so that is where we are headed. It takes you to this page, which just gives at the top some information generally about what the PRISM qualitative database is and what it is not, how it's organized, how you can use it, just some notes for you to refer to if you are interested. There's a little screenshot here of the database itself. And then this table that is interactive is actually the database. It's a bit small, but if you click on this view larger version down on the bottom right-hand corner, it will then take you into a new tab where it's full screen and a lot easier to work with. So I highly recommend doing that. So I am going to first describe just an overall orientation to the database, which I did briefly in the presentation, but a bit more in depth here where it's interactive. And then I'll go through a few different examples of ways people might be interested in using the database. So this is the overview tab, which I referred to earlier as like the table of contents. And each of these rows indicates a single interview guide. And so you can see that which study it came from is listed, as well as a citation, the data collection type, as I just scroll along the bottom here, the topic, population that was used or interviewed or engaged with using the guide, whether they were an implementer or a recipient of the intervention, the setting, and then the implementation phase, which is broken out into pre-implementation, implementation, and post-implementation with the check marks indicating when that guide was used. And then whether or not the study was part of a larger initiative. And then each of the PRISM and ReAIM domains has its own column to note which of the domains was used in each of the guides. You'll notice that for some of them, it kind of cuts it off a little short. You can make that a little bit bigger so you can see the whole thing, or you can always hover over it, and that will allow you to see the full name of the domain. So like characteristics, if we hovered over it, you can see that's of implementers, or you can drag to see a little bit better as well. So we have a column like that for each of the domains, as well as the ReAIM dimensions. And then the last two columns are just to tell you how many guides were used alongside that guide. So some of them, it was the only guide used in that study. Some of them are part of a study that used multiple guides. And then how many questions were included in that individual guide, just to give you some context about how the guide was used. So then within the database, there are 13 tabs, if you will, of the individual PRISM domains and ReAIM dimensions and all of the questions that addressed that domain. So I am going to show you how you can filter and kind of make this a little bit more usable, because you'll see that in the perspectives of the implementers tab, there are 201 questions. So it's quite a bit to just kind of scroll through and take all in, especially when you can't see all of the rows at one time. So if you filter it, it makes it a little bit more digestible, in my opinion. So if you had, when you were on this initial overview tab, seen that there were 6 guides for this veteran clinical decision support tool study, you might be really interested in learning a bit more about those guides and how they were used, because maybe you too are designing a study where you're going to interview both recipients and implementers across multiple phases of implementation. So if you were to go to the perspectives of the implementers tab, you could then click on filter, add a condition, and then click on study name and select the Veteran Clinical Decision Support Tool study. And what that will do is narrow down the 201 questions just to 19 questions that were used in that single study while still giving you all of the information. I'm going to make the questions a tiny bit smaller for a moment, about how the data was collected, what phase. So you can see both pre-implementation and post-implementation phase were used in this study, who it was used with, and then I think interestingly, whether or not there are any other domains that these questions addressed, because many of the questions addressed more than one PRISM domain or REAM dimension. Also, it is a bit frustrating, in my opinion, to have to kind of see the question and everything else. So if you have a question you're interested in, if you click on this expand option with the arrows, you can then see all the information about that question, the question written out in full. And then if you scroll, each of the information that's in the columns, but all at once, so you don't have to kind of scroll back and forth across, which is really nice once you find a question that you're interested in. And then if you want to see all of the questions again, you can just go ahead and click this little trash can and it will bring everything back for you so that you can then kind of look at all of the questions that are in that tab. I also wanted to show how you can add multiple filters. So we'll use a different tab just for some variety here. But if you are interested in doing a study that may be focused on a single setting in a single phase of implementation, you can add multiple filters to then allow you to see only the questions that were used in that setting at that time. So you can add a condition group instead of doing a condition. So if you click on condition group here, it will allow you to add multiple things. Then you click the plus arrow and then add condition. And you can then select whatever you want to filter. But in this case, we are going to filter for setting because we are interested in the community setting. And then we are also interested in an implementation phase. So we are going to switch this or to and so that it has to have both of these things be true. And then we're going to click implementation phase. And we are interested in the post-implementation phase. And then this has narrowed these things down so that we're only seeing the questions that are in the post-implementation phase and were conducted in the community setting. So that really narrows the questions down and allows you to really get an idea of how specific setting or topic was used at a certain time point in the implementation phase. But again, the same things all apply. You can expand certain questions if you're interested in them and always adjust these columns to see more or less depending on what you're interested in. So I think I'll leave it at that. That's 2 case situations on how to use it, and then happy to answer any specific questions or if there was something that was confusing or unclear, happy to clarify.
Thank you so much, Emily. I am looking at the questions in the chat. I wanted to kind of briefly summarize that we have the request for direct link to the actual database. So there is an Airtable link that you can all use, or I provided the REAM page relevant section, which is also providing you with some guidance. Juliana, thank you so much for the praise. I agree. I didn't know about Airtables until I saw it somewhere and I thought this is perfect match for this. And Emily did a great job becoming a master of Airtable. So we didn't have the resources to create a programmer created separate database, but this works so well. So I'm so excited about future work as well. Also wanted to bring forward that there are others who are talking about how they make up their own questions. And I would just say that that's how we have gone about this so far. And I think we will all continue, but this database could serve as an inspiration or potentially just kind of, we can expand it and eventually as a source to create your interview guides. And so if you have an interview guide that you would like to share with us, I cannot make a promise on timeline, but we are planning to expand this and we will add more interview guides to this database eventually. So contact us with that. Emily, for you, in terms of questions, I am looking at people are saying that they will bookmark this and will definitely use it. I think that we covered the questions that came in so far.
While you're
Russ,
looking, I'll just make a quick comment. You
yes,
mentioned inspiration, and I really envision when thinking about how to use this tool, it's very similar to like a Pinterest board for qualitative research. So, you might go to Pinterest and get like inspiration on how you want to design something or a meal you want to make. This is very similar in that when you're thinking about creating a qualitative interview guide, you can come to this and kind of narrow down and kind of see how other people have developed this, not to necessarily cherry pick questions from this, but instead get inspiration on wording or how people might have framed things so that you can then take it and make it your own.
that's a very great point, Emily. Thank you so much. So, of course, Russ is throwing us not soft balls, but very hard balls here, asking about, distinction of different settings and how the different items differed in terms of frequency. Just to read it specifically, were there differences between the VA and community health center site interviews in terms of which domains were assessed more frequently? And I don't know if we have looked at that yet.
Yeah, I did not look at a setting specific analysis, so that's a great future direction. We did break down the analysis across implementation phases, so I can speak a little bit more to how the questions varied across implementation phase, but less so about the specifics across individual settings, just because there were so many different categories for settings, it was difficult to necessarily group them and get a nice clean analysis, but we did look at both implementation phase as well as the role of the interviewer, whether they're a recipient or an implementer. So I can speak to some differences there, but less so about the settings.
Yeah, and I think it's a great idea to start to think about that. Also, I think one of the messages was that certain areas we are just not assessing, and I don't think it's because it's less important, but perhaps because we have not thought about it as much. So I don't know, Emily, if you have any comments about that, whether you feel that the areas where we saw less questions, they are just not as important, or they were not prioritized in these interviews.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's about importance. I do think that since we framed this project around PRISM, people went into that with the four PRISM domains in mind when they were labeling the guides. And we collaborated with an investigator on the original study since they had the context necessary to label the questions. So they might have had more of a PRISM lens when applying this, as opposed to really considering all of the re-aim dimensions as well. So I think that's a big part of it. I know we've had a lot of discussions about adoption, for example, since it was the lowest overall and why that might not have come up. And we hypothesized that since people were doing interviews with people who were implementing interventions, they had already kind of gotten past that initial adoption phase. And so that might not have been captured just based on when these interviews were conducted across implementation. I noticed that Russ asked us to say a little bit more about the implementation phase, and I can share a bit more about that if that's okay.
That would be wonderful. And while you do that, I'm going to pre-warn Julie that I'm going to, if she's in a good position, invite her to state her last question. So Julie, let us know in the chat whether that's okay, and we will just make sure that we can unmute you and you can share your thoughts.
Alrighty, it's like I anticipated Russ's question here. So this is the table that breaks down the different question domain or the different PRISM domains across the different phases of implementation. And so you can see that we have our PRISM domains and then also our re-aim dimensions down the left-hand column there. And then just at the bottom, a total of the questions across each of the phases of implementation. Since post-implementation was the most common, it was interesting to see that implementation actually had more questions than the post-implementation phase overall, suggesting that maybe the implementation interviews were a little bit more into the nitty-gritty while people were really doing the implementation, and the post-implementation interviews might have been a bit shorter. But that is, I don't know if there's anything else specifically to highlight here. You can kind of take in the table overall, but it is interesting to see how kind of the different domains ebb and flow. But some of them too are also pretty consistent, like characteristics of recipients was almost a third, a third, a third across all of them. So this depended on the specific domain.
Super. Emily, there is a kind of pragmatic question that I don't know that I can answer because you became the Airtable person. So let me ask that, and then I will invite Julie to ask her question because I
Great.
sense also a guidance for us here, what to do next. So
Perfect.
Shannon is asking, the Airtable is cool and super helpful. Maybe a silly question. No, I have no idea what the answer is. Is this the equivalent of a cloud-based version of Excel?
Yeah, it's very similar to like it's like a techie version of Google Sheets, almost if you will. So I actually imported a Google Sheets into Airtable and then just edited it. It does have AI features. I did not delve into the AI features because I had already set it up in Excel and then Google Sheets transferred it over. But it is very similar to Excel, except you have more features in terms of presentation of the data. So like the color coding, the filtering is a little bit easier to do than Excel. It's a little bit more user friendly. And the feature that was most important for us is that people could use it and filter, but not necessarily like change the data so that everyone will have the same questions that are in there. No one is going in and changing the questions, but you can filter to your heart's content to get exactly what you need. It's a good question.
Thank you so much.
But I'm still very much a novice. I'm learning about Airtable, but it is a really cool program and it was free. So you too could become an Airtable expert.
Oh, I love that. Julie, do you want to come on and ask your very, very insightful question, but also give us guidance on how you would approach this?
Yes, hello everyone. I I guess I can't put on my camera. That's fine. My question is, if there's guidance from the gurus of Reaim and Prism about certain questions maybe are quite good and close at assessing a particular PRISM domain, and maybe some example questions in the database are a little broader and maybe aren't quite as closely tied to assessing a particular PRISM domain. So I wonder if there's any guidance about that in the qualitative database, because I would imagine audience members would want that. I'm guessing, I haven't looked at it, of course, but I'm guessing there's a variety of ways of phrasing questions for each PRISM domain that are examples in the database, and maybe some are a little tighter and some are a little looser using colloquial terms.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
a great point. When I'm hearing almost like a quality rating. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, given you're the experts, you know what I mean? I, as an audience member, I want to have some guidance from you experts about how to phrase these questions to assess a particular domain.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So, a few comments on that. Right now, each individual question doesn't have like a quality rating, if you will. However, that being said, we were very intentional with the guides that we selected to include in this database. We're very thoughtful to include guides that had a member of the Reaim Prism group that had been an investigator on that study and had been involved in the development of the guides. So, each of these guides were considered exemplar guides in how to address them. They have different styles. Some of them did things in different ways. But we were very intentional with quality control for the guides that we selected for this initial round. But that's a really interesting idea of like creating some sort of rating or indication of conciseness or quality in terms of the question. So thanks for raising that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I think, and that's what I meant, Julie, that as you are thinking about it being a qualitative expert, when I think about formulating my own interview guides, sometimes I choose to be a little bit more open-ended, and in other cases, I am trying to get to the point really sharply. And so it almost feels like I remember when the first review came out on theories, models, and framework for the implementation science, they talked about the level of flexibility. So the question could be very open-ended or a little bit more directive. And perhaps it's a rating instead of quality, it's a rating of the flexibility of that question or the openness, which could be appropriate depending on the intent of the interview.
Yeah, I love that. I think that would be wonderful. And I think we have to recognize context, right? So it's always context specific as we develop these guides, rightly so. And so the phrasing, the thinking about assessing these particular domains has to be contextualized, right? And so I think that in some ways it's a very hard ask, but I do think some guidance on the website would be helpful to reassure people a little bit so that they can make some assessments around, do I need to tweak this question to think about exactly what you just said, Borska? Excellent point about how open versus how directive am I going to be in my style based on my research question or my evaluation question. And how can I maybe, is it okay? How much can I contextualize this to my local setting? I think it's excellent. It's wonderful work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julie. This is great. I love these different other directions we can take, and hopefully we will. So please, others, anything else that you have recommendations on, anything else that you have recommendations wise, or the way that you see it being used, please indicate it in the chat or raise your hand and we will make you a speaker. I don't know how to do the camera allowance. I apologize for that. Planned next steps. Emily, do you want to speak to that? Perhaps both papers mention those, but then how do we see it? And I can speak to that further in the future.
Yeah, for sure. So we have written this that we presented, written it up, and it's in waiting to be submitted. So hopefully we will have that paper published shortly is the goal, so that it will be in print with both the process of creating the database as well as the initial guidance that we presented here today. And then for next steps, we are going to write a second paper that really focuses more on the qualitative research spectrum. This first paper focuses primarily on the data collection side of things, so creating a guide, getting the data. But I noticed that there have been some questions in the chat about analysis, for example, so we're interested in bringing that more into the second paper, as well as just kind of talking about the whole spectrum from creating a research question all the way through reporting of results using PRISM for qualitative research. Now it's going to put the discussion questions in the chat here. Go ahead, Borja.
That's super. And I just wanted to say that, all of these, like Julie's point, that perhaps there are other ways of classifying questions, providing guidance on, how do you decide whether you want to be more open-ended or more directive? All of those are very helpful for us because I think that's another direction we can go. I also would like to acknowledge that there is a little bit of controversy around trying to prescribe or kind of harmonize how data is collected and qualitative methods or qualitative research. And we certainly are very aware of that. And I think the goal is more to create a shared way of thinking about it rather than prescribe that this is the right way of asking about implementation and sustainability infrastructure. There are different ways to do so. I know many of you are familiar with the CIFR interview guide generator, which I think is soon back running with the CIFR 2.0. I don't think it's there yet. And I know that many early folks who are early in the implementation science journey found that very helpful as a first draft for their interview guide, but we never thought that that's the final draft. So all of these are tools to make implementation science more accessible. And I think that that's very important to us. More questions are coming in. Emily, did you see anything that you want to pick up?
There is a question here about the hybrid in deductive and inductive coding, and I recently did this for a project, so I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. So with the deductive coding, that is when you could take the PRISM domains themselves and apply them as codes, or in the case for my project, I'd used rapid qualitative analysis, so these were actually like domains in the matrix themselves. But then in addition to doing that, you can also add inductive codes that help you answer your research question for things that emerged throughout your data collection. So things you maybe didn't expect to see when you first wrote your interview guide, or things that are really important to capture to answer your research question overall. So you have kind of a hybrid approach where you are applying these PRISM codes, then also applying additional codes to help answer your research question, and then creating a full picture from that. So I hope that is helpful in answering that question.
I think I'm also kind of looking at the next question from Alejandra Huerta about the use of PRISM to report qualitative findings. And in the second part, it's mentioned sub-themes. And I think one of the pieces that I am reflecting on is one of the characteristics of PRISM is that these are very broad domains. CIFAR, just to bring another one into the discussion, has a much more structured subdomain system. And so I think one of the pieces that we can reflect on is how to provide more guidance for individuals as they think about like implementation and sustainability infrastructure, because we don't necessarily have preset subdomains. So that's something to think about. And I think another area where we can make some additional guidance.
For sure. And I also think a resource that I use, not to plug the website again, but I also, when I'm, trying to think about these things, there is a lot of really helpful guidance on the website about things that kind of fall underneath each of the PRISM domains and their re-aim dimensions, and really good examples about kind of what to consider within each of those things. So before we get the guidance out, if you all are thinking about that, that's a great resource to kind of go and consider the complete list of everything that each domain captures.
Another interesting recommendation from Nikki Cato was to think about how different areas or questions hang together. So how can you go from question A to consider also use question B? I love that. I have to think about how that comes together in practice, but I really good idea, especially that qualitative questions are usually interconnected. So I really
Yeah, and I think it's multi-level too. It's not just which questions go together. It's also which domains go together in a single question as well, since we saw that questions are also commonly addressing multiple PRISM domains or re-aim dimensions. So it's kind of like a nested structure there.
Yeah, that is super. And then Kim is mentioning, she already mentioned that they have created their own guides, and it seems like PRISM and CIFAR are being used together, which actually is a recent discussion for us where we see an opportunity for PRISM and CIFAR being complementary instead of the same. And so hopefully in the near future we can report on that process. We are working with some folks from the CIFAR work group. But I love that you are already combining those two. Okay, and Russ is very congratulatory of Emily's promotion of the website. But yes, there are a lot of great resources there. I think it is very rich in terms of what you can find there. Any other questions? I think we captured the ones that were included, right?
I think so. If you all have anything else that you would like us to consider as we continue to develop guidance, particularly for that second paper we're planning on writing, please do put your ideas in the chat. We're very open to ideas at this point, so I'm willing to take all of those into consideration.
Yeah. Anyone else would like to come on to share a live question as a last closing question? I know that we can always count on Russ to do, no one else will do it. So I hope, Russ, you have one more for us before we can close off.
I don't, can you hear me?
Yes.
Had to get the approval button. First, I'd like to see if anybody else did. I've probably been far too active already, but see if there's another question or comment. If not, I can make a quick one.
I think you should go, Russ. I am looking at the chat, and I think people are not posting additional ones, but please, if you think of something, put it in the chat. But Russ, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, well, this is just a brainstorm, but in terms of generating new questions and looking at the ones, using the ones we already have, but I was wondering about doing a type of informal crosswalk with the quantitative survey measures that we now have. Recently, I put in there both about PRISM domains and then about the re-aim dimensions, and then looking there as some inspiration. And maybe in particular, Julie was talking about ones that were a little more concrete or specific versus global, if that might be a way to generate some more questions as a question generator too, to go back and look at what those more specific structured survey questions were.
And I wonder, Russ, and this is perhaps going to be again controversial, but I will bring it up because it's the elephant in the room. How could we benefit from AI to take interview guides and learn about how we are asking questions and then help us think about, I don't know if it's better asking better questions or adjusting the questions to a certain context or population eventually?
Yeah, way above my pay grade, but I
Mhm.
like it, and particularly kind of the iterative notion. And as you, several people have commented about the context adjusting, since many of these did come from a VA context, and some of them are kind of specific that way. So I think that would be great. So, I kind of like these questions, but this is my context here that's quite different and things. Again, as you said, and I think we all know, not as providing a definitive answer or something you just want to take necessarily, uncritically. But I think that's a cool idea.
Really wonderful discussion. Please keep in touch with us. Emily, what would be the best way to keep in touch with us? Would you like your email for this purpose or use a more
Yeah,
central?
they can email me. I'll put my email in the chat. You can also find me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. But happy to answer any emails. So there's my email in the chat if you all have any questions. But happy to continue the conversation offline.
I see Julie's additional comment, and then I would just say that we really appreciate you being here. I am going to slowly close us down. This was a very rich discussion, great ideas. Continue it again via email, and then we will have additional webinars planned for the REAM PRISM work group. I don't think that we have it specifically set yet. If you have some ideas, if you have your own work, let us know. So contact us about that as well. And thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate our community and look forward to hopefully working with you in the near future.
Okay, it seems like everyone's leaving, so I'll stop recording for now.